A penultimate panel to introduce a group of amazing designers here on stage for a conversation that we are loosely calling Design Drives Change. I think everybody in this audience understands implicitly that design drives change. So in order to explore the idea, I pulled together 3 people who are truly experts in their field. The thing about these 3 people is on the surface, they actually have nothing in common. We have Krista, who is actively out, you're designing, let's see, products to improve the health of people who make less than $4 a day, mostly outside the United States. We have Jan. Your clients make a lot more than $4 a day. You're working with Fortune 500 companies, but you are thinking about a lot of the same people that Krista's thinking about. And Kate, you're down in the valley. You're at Facebook as the director of design. So I'm going to actually not do the hard work. I'm going to turn the question over to you. What do y'all think that you have in common as designers?
You're going to ask me. You know, I think there's been a lot made about design thinking and what design thinking means. And to me, and I think, I assume I share this with the others, it's just this notion of problem solving, being attracted to insights, creativity, collaboration, and then flawless execution at the end. And really knowing who you're designing for, the challenges that you're designing for.
So Kate, that's essentially a discipline. What we're talking therefore, that's the discipline of design.
Yeah.
And that is what you guys all approach your work through the lens of, I would assume. So let's explore a little bit the work that each of you is doing and then look for the common ties. I'm going to skip over you, Jan. It's not because you're the only guy on the panel. Don't feel bad about that. Make sure to get your airtime. But Krista, let's start with your work. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing every day.
Sure. So our focus, as Jesse said, is products that improve the lives or increases the income of people living on less than $4 a day. So we're talking about the developing world. Our focus right now is medical devices. And we have 2. One is phototherapy, blue light for severely jaundiced babies. How many folks here have kids? Okay, good. Who had kids with jaundice? Okay, so there's a few of you now. But about 17% of all babies need to be treated with that blue light, and the blue light is $3,000 to $8,000. We designed one for $400. Our focus is India, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. 90% of hospitals in these places do not have effective care. So you have kids who get brain damage or die from something as easy to treat as jaundice. So that's an example of something we're doing.
Excellent. So Jan, you're working in similar parts of the world. How do you approach your work, and who are your clients?
So we work a lot for Fortune 500 clients. I've been fortunate enough to work a lot in so-called emerging markets, including base of the pyramid consumers, $2 to $4 a day. And actually, you know, a lot of corporations, when they look at working in that space, they're not necessarily sure about how they should frame the relationship with those consumers or even what the opportunity is. And a lot of our work is in, first of all, informing them on just foundational understanding of who they are.
Right.
And then the strategies that they use to get by in the world. And that is often great inspiration for them bringing products to market. A really simple example, we just did a project with Visa in Rwanda. Visa, as you know, is, in their own words, targeting consumers from country clubs and, you know, traditionally, and they're increasingly looking to target consumers, everyone, everywhere.
Sure.
So we run a 3-month project for them to help both understand consumers and then design for that.
So you're actually, you spend a lot of time in these places, right? I assume you spent a good part of that 3 months in.
The team was on the ground for 3.5 months in Rwanda. Right?
On the ground. And are you on the ground for a lot of your work?
We are, but we're structured a little bit differently. So we're based in San Francisco, but we have partners all over the place. So for example, with a phototherapy device, we partnered with the biggest maker of neonatal equipment in India. They manufacture, distribute, sell. We leverage all of their networks. They do servicing. So we really try and leverage the best that exists in the markets we're focused on.
Got it. So Kate, let's come over to you. You probably don't spend that much time on the ground in Africa, I'm guessing?
No, but I do have a very integral part of our design team at Facebook is the user experience team, and they are on the ground. They were just in India, Indonesia. Right now they're in Georgia, in the States here. But yeah, no, very similar to these guys. We're also thinking about markets where people don't have access to smartphones, don't have access to big data,
Right.
and enabling them to connect.
That global context is really something that all three of you share.
And I think also, Jesse, the user aspect, I think that's something that runs fairly strongly through all three of us, is the focus on kind of this user-centric design and really understanding who are our users and designing for that.
So explain a little bit more about that, because I have to tell you, Krista, we often, every year, we have a conversation on design, and there's always this, there's a lot of talk about designing for the user, putting the user first. Can you peel that back and explain what that means a little bit?
Sure, so I'll give it to you from my perspective. Everybody's got their own perspective.
Yeah.
So when we think about users, we think about not just who the user is, but who the purchaser is, who the maintenance person is, who's gonna fix the device. In hospitals, for example, we're really trying to sell into the public sector of India. So those go through a tendering system with state governments, they're users, because they're looking for certain things. But then we're also looking at the context. How has this problem been maybe or maybe not solved before? What's the electricity like? What are the voltage surges like? What's the air temperature like? One of the things we see is that medical devices are really worldwide designed for conditions here. They're not designed for like 40 degrees C. They're not designed for really high humidity places because they assume that the hospitals are going to temperature and humidity control, which 90% of the world, that doesn't happen.
That's very much, it seems to me when I think about your work, when you're designing medical devices, you don't want to make a mistake.
You can't,
You don't want to
especially
make
with this
a mistake.
user group, yeah.
So, a big part to what I understand about design is that it's iterative, that it's about trying things, failing fast. How does, for example, the kind of iteration that you're doing at Facebook compare to the kind of iteration you might be doing, Krista?
I'll let Kate start with Facebook. How about that?
Well, I mean, I'm privileged to, we're designing for 1 billion people, which is very different than designing for a very specific group of people, which means that often we have to, make things very simple to use, usable, useful, and then let it adapt to the technology that it's sitting on, whether it's mobile or desktop. And we have a vast, expansive testing framework, so we can, push different changes to different groups of people and be very specific about who we test with, see the reactions, through the data that comes in, but also go out. We have a robust team that goes out and talks to them as well. So I can't imagine designing a physical device. I mean, it's the difference between software and hardware, right? So.
But there are a lot of similarities.
Yeah.
So another project we have is a prosthetic knee for amputees who've lost their leg above their knee. And the first iteration, which we have here, Stephanie, I don't know if
I think Adam
has it. This prototype, yeah, bring it here, come be our Vanna. Thanks. So this actually was the first version of the knee, and what this replaced was a single axis, which is, just think of a door hinge. But so people were really eager to get this because this mechanism mimics a natural gait. But one of the things, the feedback we got, do you want to be walking around with a click?
That's
No.
a bummer.
Yeah, so, and what we found, people were very sensitive, obviously, to being able to blend in with the general population. The other comment we got is if you look at the profile here, it's actually pretty obvious if you're wearing a prosthetic under your skirt or your pants. And what we saw was that users were actually modifying the device themselves, which I would actually say is a big lesson for all of us. When you see users modifying your product, that's an indication of like maybe what you should be thinking about. So this is the version 3. There's a version in the middle, but you'll notice there's, and I can pass these around, there's a noise dampener in here. It's a little bit quieter. And then you have a bit of a better profile. So we took a lot of these, and one of the things I like to think about is not so much failing fast, I know that's what we love to say in Silicon Valley, but iterating fast, and really using these lessons very quickly to get the products improved as quickly as possible and get them back to users to get that feedback.
Krista, what do you say you throw those knees out to the audience? They can pass them around while we chat.
Vanna?
And
it's good for them, don't you think?
the idea that users modify the tools that we give them is this really creative and interesting idea. And Jan, it's one of my favorite things about your work as I've watched it unfold over the last few years. You go out in the world and look at how people are actually using the tools that we give them for one use, right? Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you might give us a great example of the way that consumers took one product and did something else with it.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, just to frame that a little bit, our clients are asking us to go to the New York, Milan, London, Paris, kind of cultural, Tokyo, Seoul, cultural centers of the world. But in the last 7 years, we've seen a massive increase in clients that are interested in Rio de Janeiro, Chongqing, Mumbai, Kabul, places that, in terms of innovation, are less likely traditionally, but frankly are a great source of inspiration for us. So to answer your question, a few years ago in Rwanda, looking at people using mobile phones, people who had spent a month's salary on getting a $30 or $20 mobile phone and airtime, and people were using that to send each other money. But there was no formal money sending service available. And what they would do is they would buy a prepaid scratch card in the city, Kampala, and instead of using it to top up their own phone, they would send a text message to the village where their relatives were and call up and give them their scratch-off number. And the person in the village could then take that number and top up their own phone, which was raw materials for the phone operator service. And then they would hand cash over to the person for a 20% commission to the person who actually needed it. That was a precursor to what is now mobile money, right? And that's purely ground up, no one planned it, completely evolutionary service that was an indicator of something that now is, a round table breakfast at Fortune Tech.
Exactly. So when you were doing that work, Jan, was that when you were at Nokia?
That was, yeah.
So how did that work feed into, at the time, a few years ago, that was actually pretty far out into the future. How did it feed into what Nokia was doing at the time?
So, and that speaks to the challenge of where design or research fits into an organization.
Right.
First of all, a lot of organizations, I'm not going to talk about anyone specifically, move at a certain pace, which is a little dissimilar to some of our neighbors.
A certain pace that's not quite as fast as Facebook?
Yes. For example, you guys are iterating on a daily basis, right? Mm-hmm. So on the one side, it takes longer to go through an organization. And there was a lot of lessons actually learned from why it took so long to go through. And then secondly, each organization, corporation has its own view of which markets and what scale of markets they want to go into.
Right.
And for an already large company, those options, the smaller players were less interested.
Right.
They actually launched a mobile money pilot in India. That was shut down a year and a half ago or something like that.
So in the time that you've been in this work, Jan, have you seen businesses, and I don't necessarily even mean the tech-forward businesses coming out of the valley, but Fortune 500 companies who are your clients, are they getting better at incorporating design?
Well, it depends on your definition of design, right? And actually, to go back to your original question, I don't consider myself a designer, or if I am one, I'm a pretty poor designer.
You wait till now to tell us this? I mean...
I know. So, I think it goes back to, we were talking earlier about what design is and what the practice is, and you were talking about craft, right? And the ability to execute on craft. But this whole notion of what a designer is has changed radically over, in terms of design thinking, end-to-end consumer experience. For me personally, it's simply being curious about the world, and probably by the time someone can figure out what it is and put a label on what it is that I do,
right,
it's already kind of a little boring to me. So.
Right. Next year we'll invent a new title for you. You referenced the word design thinking. You referenced the word design thinking, Krista. I don't think I've heard you say it yet, but many of the people I write about love to use that word when they're talking about why their company is innovative or progressive or going to succeed. It feels a little jargony to me. It doesn't feel like it has a lot of meaning.
Especially now, yeah.
Yeah.
We agree.
Yeah.
But I think, I'll add, I think the value of design thinking is it's bringing a lot of design tools to all disciplines. And I think with the type of work we all do, you have to take a broad look at some of the problems we're trying to solve. We all kind of agree that design is essentially about problem solving. And you do need business people, you do need researchers, you need all these different folks, not just the traditional designer. And I think the great thing about design thinking is that it brought these tools to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So even though we're a little tired of the word.
Yeah.
Actually, we were talking about the skills that kind of brought us to where we were, right? And being a designer and being interested in sitting in BD meetings and...
Yeah, like Jan, I have to say, I'm embarrassed. I opened Illustrator the other day for the first time in a couple years, so it's been a while. But I think that's because my specific interest in design, I came up through the ranks, quickly found people that I thought could design much better than I did. Mm-hmm. But the piece of design that I love was the problem-solving angle and staying after in the business meetings when the designers were not interested and really figuring out how design could solve a business issue. and how to approach the problem, who are we designing for, what were our goals, how are we going to measure them, and then assembling that perfect team of problem solvers to go out and figure things out.
So design is very amorphous. I mean, if you're going to be an engineer, you go to a good engineering program and you get a degree and it says you're an engineer, or you drop out of high school and teach yourself to code. Real quick down the panel, how did each of you come through the educational system and arrive at the title of designer or whatever it is you are?
So I went through the engineering path. I did like the hard mechanical engineering. I say hard because it's like they say hard and soft in engineering. And then I progressively became softer and softer and ended up in product design.
Failed economist and being asked to do a bunch of stuff and figuring out there's a better way to do it. And just not telling anyone I'd do it the way I wanted to do it. And sooner or later the organization buys into it. You show the value in it. So.
Yeah. I came up more traditionally, got a graphic design degree, started out doing identity, advertising, then the web came along and changed that. But to your point about design being amorphous and design thinking, I do think sometimes people fall in love with the process and forget about the execution piece at the end. I can have great people that get into a room and they can synthesize their insights, but if I don't have a team that can translate that into flawless execution, you're really kind of missing the point. And I have seen us kind of fall in love with the process sometimes and overblow it a bit.
So that can be particularly important at a company like Facebook because speed is really your mandate. Mm-hmm. And when you're moving so fast, you need to take the ball over the goal line, so to speak. How do you move fast and keep the discipline of design at the center of the culture?
I mean, for us, it's been a lot about prototyping, getting to a prototype as fast as possible. An idea on a PowerPoint slide or on a sticky is an idea, but and it could sound great, but once you actually physically interact with it or see someone else interact with it, that's when the real learning comes. So I would say that we prototype extremely quickly and get to.
So I want to bring our audience into the mix. Do we have any questions? Okay, we're gonna start with Phil and go right around the room. And for our mic handlers, we'll go to the Yaffe brothers after.
Great, thank you. Phil Libin with Evernote. I wonder how you think about when you're designing something, your moral obligation to design for your existing users and customers versus your moral obligation to design for people who aren't yet your users and customers. Specifically, the more people you have actually using a product, the more you get a wealth of ideas to draw from. You get a wealth of inspiration, but there's also a lot of expectations. There's a lot of drag that it introduces, and as you kind of go through different stages of scaling your product, something like Facebook, you're plausibly already a large percentage of the world that's going to use you is using you. So maybe your moral obligation to existing users becomes very easy to justify. When you're a bit smaller, if you're a startup and you have 1,000 users and you still have 7 billion people that aren't using it, it's a bit of a harder impact. So I wonder how actually each of the three of you think about that.
So we're a little bit different. I should back up and say, so we actually have very narrowly defined user groups. And I think our challenge is understanding not so much, we're trying to understand variances from geography to geography, and I'd say that's one of our challenges. I think what I see, like just putting on a design hat generally, is I think you're exactly right. We do see a lot of products that get overloaded, particularly in software, with newer features, which weights down the product. And I think medical devices are a great example. You have these very expensive Western ones, very expensive devices with a lot of bells and whistles to justify that price tag, when what's happening is like most of these features aren't being used and the core functions aren't even being used properly. In our case, we strip that down back to the core functionality.
For us, often that's a key question that the client's asking us is, should we be extending our existing or have an evolution of our existing product line or services, or should we be creating something wholly new?
And then obviously our goal is to make the product as accessible to everyone in the world. And obviously we do think about our existing users and the new ones, and we do think carefully about how we launch new things to existing users. And then just adapting the interface depending on who's using the product.
I think the question actually is becoming far more nuanced and far more morally fraught as the products we're designing are inherently interconnected in some shape or form. And so the question of whether you adopt a technology can increasingly become one of whether you opt into or opt out of society, right, in some shape or form. So there's that kind of social pressure. And the second trajectory is increasingly we're being asked to design things where they're in the world around us, and this notion of the user is evolving to one of a constituent or someone who's essentially using, but they're not aware of that usage. And so you have a kind of very particular moral frame and set of challenges. And actually, for me, that's the most interesting work that we do is trying to figure out that moral line or that ethical issue.
Like specifically around like the needs, right?
Sure. So we gotta get you a mic so everyone can
We'll
hear.
talk
Phil.
knees after. How about that?
No. I want the follow-up. Phil, ask follow-up.
So,
Okay.
so you have a population of people who have your first generation knee. And to some extent, and then you have a whole bunch of other people, probably a much larger set, that need a knee but don't have one yet.
Yeah.
And you probably feel a certain level of responsibility for people who already embraced your product or actually using it, and there's stuff you can do to make their experience better. It's not necessarily the same as the stuff you would do to get a better knee to far more people. And I think that balance at a much less important scale is probably the main challenge that we face, is kind of figuring that out, and it must be very sharp for you particularly. And
God doesn't like that question. Could you try again? Krista, go for it.
I mean, you're absolutely right. One of the things that we didn't get a chance to talk about, which I think is worth a little bit of airtime, is we approach design in a system way. So really trying to understand, we're not just designing a product, but we're designing like a solution to solve this problem. And with the knee, it's very interesting because there's only like a market really of 5% of the possible market. So the biggest challenges we have isn't necessarily like adapting the knee, but it's making sure there are skilled processes in the places that we need to work. It's making sure the supply chains work. If you have a leg, the knee is one component of it. You still need a socket, you need a pylon, you need a foot. So the customers that we've been dealing with, they've been less focused on the generation of the knee, but solving these other problems in this whole system. And I think from my standpoint, again, because we're trying to remobilize people as compared to just making a bunch of knees, our focus has been on this kind of broader system.
Okay,
we can
so
talk
I'm
more
going to move over
later.
to the Yaffe brothers and speak up.
Hi, Jonathan Yaffe from AnyRoad. So all of you guys are designing these products for what's inherently really different cultures. And so my question is, when designing a product that's meant for a really international audience, a worldwide audience that's not necessarily localized, how do you balance building something for the lowest common denominator versus trying to tailor it to the way that people use these products in each different market?
No, I mean, at least for us, so we have been adapting for different markets. Like this week there was an article about Facebook for every phone. So recognizing in some markets it's very hard to get data. And so we realized we just stripped some of the functionality out of that, see what people were using the most, and also just technically speed things up. But a lot of it is also just knowing that when people come to Facebook, they usually come to read their news feed, message someone else, or post something. And that's what you mainly make it about. And then allow them to progressively discover other things as needed.
So from our point of view, again, it's a critical question for clients is, are we designing for China? Are we designing for APAC? Are we designing for global? What we've seen, or what I've seen over the last decade, is increasingly the places where people start to answer those questions are shifting, and they shift from the London, New York, Paris, San Franciscos of the world to other places that inherently have been enabled in some shape or form by connectivity. That's one. And then on the other side is, and actually this came from a conversation I had with Phil yesterday, is so often, the way that we express itself, the way that we, for example, express status, is very different not only within this room, but with someone who's in a village in Rwanda versus someone in a penthouse in Shanghai. But we all have some notion of status. And understanding and being able to tap that kind of underlying human need is fundamentally, I think, what underpins a lot of our work here.
Some notion of status, as in, give me an example of that.
Okay, so from this project in Rwanda with Visa, I was in a village interviewing a lady who had brought electricity to that village 6 months before. Now, in my career, it's actually not that easy to find people who remember life before electricity and afterwards, right? You can find someone before and after mobile phones or Facebook or something else. And that's just a fascinating place to be at that moment in time. And we asked the question, so what was life like before electricity? How has your life changed fundamentally since you got electricity? And she said, when I go to see my relatives, the journey takes an hour longer. I mean, completely nonsensical answer, right? Pretty abstract answer. And then she took us by the hand into her living room, and she pointed to the corner of the living room, and there was a Philips $12 electric iron. Now when she travels, she irons her clothes first. It means she has to get up an hour earlier. But when she gets on that bus, her clothes have a nice crisp crease. And that crisp crease is the status symbol that tells everyone else on the bus and her relatives that they have electricity in the village. And there's a window for, you can smile at that, and I smile at that. It's a wonderful story. But you guys are no different. And I don't consider you to be any more sophisticated in your expression of status, whether it's your Tesla or your watch or that you decide to come to this conference. It's just different. And it's understanding globally what those nuances are that, frankly, gives a lot of our clients the edge.
All right. Unless you have an answer, I'd love to take one more question.
Can I just give one really quick answer? We do a lot of due diligence, and we also look for outlier cities and outlier geographies. And that's one of the lessons we've learned is try and figure out, like, if we're designing a phototherapy device that needs to be used in rural clinics, we're going to find the most rural, far-away clinic in Nepal. And we're also going to design for what I call micro-hospitals in peri-urban areas of, like, Ghaziabad, India. We can talk more later, too.
Yeah. Great. One more question. Where are we?
Yeah, can you hear me? Maddie Max, Sydney or after. So as a species, we've been inventing, designing products forever, right? We sort of design money, aqueducts, irrigation systems. And it's clear that design is so fundamental to how we work as a species. And I have a question, because I went to Berkeley and we didn't call it design thinking, we called it engineering. And I sort of see us not defining fundamentally design across all disciplines. It applies to medicine, it applies to pharmaceutical, it applies to everything. And we keep changing the notion of design.
So the question?
The question is like Stanford now has the school. Mm-hmm. And I go to 6,000 other universities and they're trying to copy Stanford as opposed to putting design thinking into existing departments.
So what's the
question? We seem to keep moving the ball. Is that helping us? Is there a better way to sort of infuse design into everything that we do?
So first of all, I would challenge everything, including the need to challenge everything, but does design need to do everything? It needs to justify its place at the table like everything else, frankly.
I would say yes. I think it's great. It's going everywhere. I think we're going to have better products. We're going to have more people trained to be problem solvers. I think we're going to have a wider range of disciplines focused on end users, and to me, that's great.
Kate?
No, I agree. I totally agree.
Frankly,
Stumped him.
So I work for a consultancy. We sell design, we sell innovation. I don't give two hoots what you call it. Fundamentally, it's about what are you trying to achieve and how do you get there. And you just don't want to get sucked into some myopic view on one way of doing it or another. If you're not challenging the process and you're asking the question of what is the right process on every single problem, you've already lost in my mind.
That's where I would mostly agree. It's falling in love with the process. Some of these programs in schools, and they forget about the actual execution and chipping and learning that can take place through that.
And that really brings us back to what you all have in common, which is a process, and a process that you all are very much in love with. And that's why we invited you guys to share that process with us, and thank you for doing that. With that, thank you very much. We will move on.